Hey everyone! Tonight we're going back to medieval Europe, when things that were perfectly normal were seen as proof that you were crazy. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. You could turn on a fan to make a soft background noise. And let's take it easy as we travel together tonight. It wasn't just strange to daydream in the Middle Ages. It was almost like asking the Inquisition to come to your door with a bucket of holy water and the energy of a man who hasn't blinked since Tuesday. People thought you had mentally wandered into hell's customer service lobby if your eyes drifted anywhere other than dirt, the Bible, or unpaid taxes. Imagine that you are a peasant in the Middle Ages. You spent the morning breaking rocks, pulling mud, or doing whatever else you do on a normal Tuesday. At 19, your body is begging you to stop working. Of course, your brain tries to get away. It slips away for a moment to think about eating bread that isn't mostly gravel, sleeping past sunrise, or getting a second shirt. Well done. You just did something wrong in your mind. Because in the medieval world, no one just zones out. If you looked off into space, it meant one of two things. A demon was talking to you in your ear. You were whispering back, and believe me, people in the Middle Ages looked out for this. These people didn't have anything else to do. There was no TV, no hobbies, and no therapy. Their favorite thing to do was to look at each other's faces and guess what kind of spiritual corruption they had. You blinked too slowly, possessed. You also had too fast of a blink. You blinked normally, but it was suspiciously normal. Daydreaming was especially hated by priests. For them, the mind was a battlefield, and the devil was just waiting for you to get bored during. Tasks. As soon as you stopped shoveling, Father Gregory jumped into the frame like a medieval jump scare and yelled, "What enters your thoughts, child?" Nothing clears your mind faster than a priest yelling at you. There were also people watching the kids. Adults thought that a child was listening to fairy voices if they stared at a butterfly. People thought elves were trying to recruit a kid if they looked at the floor. In general, parents in the Middle Ages thought their kids were just a blink away from joining a cult of the supernatural. No one was safe, not even nobles. People said that a prince who dramatically looked out of a window was sad. A princess who was lost in thought was told she had sorrow vapors, which sounds fancy, but is really just a medieval way of saying we don't know what's wrong. Get a bucket. So, yes, it's perfectly normal to daydream today. A big spiritual warning sign in medieval Europe. In a world where people only bathed twice a year and used rusty tools to settle medical disputes, the people thought that the most dangerous thing you could do was to quietly drift off into your own mind. It wasn't cute or a sign of a creative mind to talk to yourself in the Middle Ages. It was a disaster, a spiritual emergency that needed at least 3 priests, a bucket of holy water, and a neighbor who said she saw the Virgin Mary in her chicken coop. People in the Middle Ages didn't believe in harmless self-dog. No one was thinking about their thoughts. No one was practicing a speech. If your lips moved and there was no one around to see it, people would assume right away, and in a big way, you were talking to something that wasn't a person. Picture a villager in the Middle Ages seeing their neighbor mumbling to themselves while they swept the dirt floor. They didn't think about the poor guy, who was weak and sick. They thought he was possessed, and they also thought we should stop letting him borrow our tools. People didn't trust the brain to come up with ideas on its own. Any sign that you were. If you were having an internal debate, it was likely that your partner was supernatural and very untrustworthy. This was something that priests were very careful about. They thought demons were great at talking to people and liked to plant ideas in the heads of people who were weak. So, if someone heard you say something like, "Where did I put that spoon?" the medieval clergy wouldn't have heard you. They heard, "O great and terrible spirit, guide my hand." All of a sudden, you were going to have a cleansing ceremony. There was chanting, candles, and at least one person who passed out on cue. People who worked alone had it even worse. People who worked alone, like shepherds, woodcutters, and millers, were always under suspicion. People didn't think you were bored if they saw you talking to yourself on a lonely hill while you were watching sheep. They thought you were getting dark spiritual advice from goat-shaped beings. The sheep probably thought badly of you too. A few people tried to keep it a secret. They would cough in the middle of a sentence or act like they were singing a song. But people who lived in the Middle Ages were very paranoid. They would pay close attention, squint hard, and tell others in a low voice that you were saying things that were not allowed. Good luck after that rumor got out. Gossip was both a way to make friends and a way to pass the time in a world without entertainment. People in the Middle Ages thought that silence was safe. Words that weren't directed at anyone were invitations. People who brought invisible forces into the conversation were not seen as strange, stressed, or creative. People thought they were spiritually leaky, dangerously open-minded, and in need of immediate, strong action. Talking to yourself today means you're a person. If you talked to yourself in medieval Europe, you were no longer a full person. People didn't laugh alone in the Middle Ages. People were supposed to laugh together in the Middle Ages, and the best way to do it was to see someone slip in mud, be chased by animals, or fall off something they shouldn't have been climbing. It was hard to imagine laughter without a show. So if someone laughed by themselves, without permission, witnesses, or a clear reason, the villagers acted like the person had just grown horns. Imagine a street in the Middle Ages that is gray, muddy, cold, and smells like animals that should not be inside. Everyone is tired, not getting paid enough, and their knees hurt. Then, out of nowhere, you hear a single laugh, softly to yourself, about something in your own head. Maybe you remembered a joke someone told you at the bar. Maybe you thought for a moment about a world where your roof didn't leak. The damage is done no matter what. Villagers in the Middle Ages would freeze in place like deer that had just seen the world's least subtle wolf. They thought laughter was more than just a sound. That was a sign. People didn't laugh because they were happy. Joy was rare, strange, and, to be honest, suspicious. In medieval Europe, happiness had to be explained, and it was best done through a public disaster or a neighbor's bad luck. Laughter that came from inside, from thought, memory, or imagination, meant something had gone around the normal way of suffering. Something had touched you, but you couldn't see it. So you, the only person laughing, became an instant example of spiritual instability. A monk who was walking by would squint his eyes and hold his rosary like people today hold pepper spray. A villager might slowly back away, thinking you were talking to spirits that regular people couldn't see, and that thought things were funny that regular people didn't. God forbid it was dark outside. In the Middle Ages, laughing alone after sunset was like saying, I'm totally possessed and want everyone to freak out right now. Priests really hated it when people laughed alone. They thought demons were funny, but in a dark, twisted way that only hurt the weak. So, if you laughed by yourself, the clergy thought the devil had told you a joke, and you were rude enough to laugh at it. The next thing you knew, the priest was sprinkling holy water on you like he was seasoning a chicken. Even worse, laughter could spread. If one person laughed. If people were alone, they might become curious or even amused, and medieval authorities couldn't let joy spread. That was the way to start a rebellion. So, in medieval Europe, if you laughed to yourself, it didn't mean you were happy. It meant that something supernatural had marked you, touched you, or rented you out for a short time. Your happiness was never yours. It was either evil or risky. These days, it's normal to cry for no reason. You get tired sometimes. There are times when you feel overwhelmed. You sometimes watched a dog video at the wrong time. But in Europe during the Middle Ages, emotional nuance didn't exist. If a tear fell from your eye without a clear, obvious, and socially acceptable reason, people thought that your soul was having problems. People in the Middle Ages thought that sadness was something that would happen. Did your crops fail? Cry. The storm knocked down your roof, and the goat wouldn't leave your bed. Weep. This winter, your third child got a fever and turned blue for no reason. Weep. Those were the rules. Tears were a planned part of the day that fit in perfectly with disasters that happened outside. But if you cried while doing something normal, like getting water, sweeping the floor, or angrily stirring a pot of something that smelled like regret, people didn't think you were too emotional. They thought it was a spiritual leak. Something inside you had broken, and no one wanted to see what would come out. Picture yourself in a market from the Middle Ages. You're tired, stressed out, and someone bumps into you with a bag of onions that big. Of a pillow, a little tear comes out. A small glimmer of how weak people are. A fishmonger stops gutting fish right away. A monk drops his bread. And an old woman grabs her chest like she's about to pass out, even though she's done this 5 times this week. People look at you like you've turned into a werewolf. They thought you weren't sad, you were sick. Medieval doctors, who were basically astrologers with knives, thought that crying without a reason was a sign of sad humors. These humors were strange fluids that were said to move around inside your body and sometimes needed to be drained with a sharp object. If someone cried for no reason, the doctor would show up with a bucket of leeches and the confidence of a man who has no idea what he's doing. Priests had their own ideas. They thought that sudden tears meant a demon had jumped on your chest like a cat and was squeezing your heart for fun. They didn't think crying was an emotion. They thought it was a way to let go of supernatural pressure. They'd They would rush over with holy water and mumble prayers while you tried to explain that you were just tired, overwhelmed by life, and the smell of medieval hygiene. People in the family even freaked out. Your family started to treat you like unstable glass, fragile, cursed, and always on the verge of embarrassing them in public if you cried too much. So, yes, people didn't think it was normal to cry for no reason. People didn't think it was emotional. People thought it meant that your soul had sprung a leak and the devil was ready to come out. In the Privacy was not a thing in the Middle Ages. It wasn't a right, a choice, or a mood. There was no such thing as privacy. Most people who lived in a medieval village lived in a one-room house with their whole family, a goat, 3 chickens, the winter grain, and sometimes a neighbor who drank too much ale and fell asleep. You were either royal or dead if you wanted to be alone. So, if someone even hinted that they wanted to be alone for a little while, away from all the noise, they weren't seen as thoughtful. People thought they were very suspicious. Wanting privacy meant you were sick, the kind of wrong that made priests nervous. Think about going outside for some fresh air to clear your head after a day of noise, mud, and being around other people. You walk to the edge of the village, looking at the trees and enjoying the wind. Within minutes, 2 villagers have seen you, exchanged dramatic looks, and told the closest person in charge, who in the medieval world was usually a man who had a hat. Why is he out there by himself? They would talk in whispers. What is he thinking about by himself? What does he need to be alone for? In their minds, peace was never the answer. There were always dark rituals, corrupting souls, or talking to forest spirits, which were somehow worse than demons because demons were polite. Privacy meant keeping things to yourself. Dangerous things happened when people kept secrets, and witchcraft was one of those things. People thought you had gone off to talk to ghosts if they saw you alone too often. And the medieval mind was very creative. There were fairies, spirits, demons, elves, and other creatures in the forest that were looking for lonely people to join them. In short, anyone who can do magic and doesn't care about other people's space. Wanting space inside was even suspicious. If you sat alone in a corner and stared at the fire, someone would eventually ask if you were feeling touched, not by emotion, but by invisible fingers from the other side. Villagers thought you were hiding something if you closed the door behind you, if you went out for a walk. The whole village came up with 3 different conspiracy theories before you got back, without telling anyone. Of course, the irony is that privacy might have kept medieval people sane, but they didn't think being alone was good for them. It was risky and dangerous, a sign that you might be losing touch with the community and falling into the hands of whatever creatures lived in their minds. Wanting space made you stand out, and in medieval Europe, being different was the first step toward being cursed. People in the Middle Ages were more afraid of the idea that someone wasn't sleeping at the same time as everyone else in the village than they were of famine, plague, or stepping on something sharp in the dark. In their eyes, sleep wasn't just a break, it was a place of spiritual battle. So, if you slept too much, too little, or at the wrong time, or if you looked like you enjoyed any part of it, the diagnosis was quick. You were cursed. Picture a medieval morning because the rooster screams loudly into everyone's windowless homes like he's angry at them for being alive. Everyone gets up at dawn. Everyone in the village gets up with the sun, reluctantly getting out of straw beds that feel like sleeping on regret. But then there's you. You sleep in for the first time in your boring, tiring life, and all of a sudden, everyone in the village is talking about you. He slept through the morning, after the sun came up, after sunrise, a gasp from everyone. Someone almost faints. If you slept too much, demons would have rocked you to sleep all night. Not kindly, but more like possessively. Medieval doctors confidently and incorrectly said that long sleep let dark spirits sit on the lungs. This sounds dramatic, but it was probably just snoring. People thought that demons liked to attach themselves to lazy people, and getting 8 full hours of sleep was a sure sign of laziness. But insomnia was even worse. If you woke up at night and couldn't go back to sleep, or if you spent too much time looking at the ceiling, dreaming of a better life, everyone thought that something had woken you up and that it wasn't friendly. There are a lot of creatures in medieval stories that came to see you while you slept. Night hags, demons, elves, spirits, and people you owed money to. People who heard you pacing at night didn't think, poor guy can't sleep. They thought, demons are trying to drag him out of bed. People thought that a restless night was a sign of spiritual warfare, not anxiety about crop failure, or the fact that you live with 10 other people and a goat that can't sleep. They were scared of not being able to sleep normally, which meant falling asleep at sunset, waking up at dawn, and doing it all over again until they died. They thought that a person's sleep showed what was going on in their soul. Sleeping too much was a sign of corruption. If you didn't get enough sleep, the forces of darkness were gnawing on your mind like rats on grain bags in the Middle Ages. So, whether you slept well, poorly, or just wanted to sleep, people in the Middle Ages saw you the same way, spiritually damaged, suspiciously out of sync with the natural order, and possibly halfway to becoming a ghost that wanders around. Sleep didn't help me recover. Sleep was a problem. People in medieval Europe didn't naturally feel happy. It was an anomaly, an unexpected glitch in the system that made people worried, suspicious, and at least one person prayed under their breath. People in the Middle Ages were always hungry, cold, and paying taxes. And the scary thought that death could be hiding behind any random puddle. People didn't think he was in a good mood today if you smiled for no reason. They thought that something had gone very wrong. Imagine walking through a medieval village and smiling a little because the sun is shining and the mud only comes up to your ankles today instead of your knees. A typical moment of hope for people. But to the people in the village, you look like someone who has been touched by forces from another world. A woman selling onions stops shouting. The blacksmith drops his hammer in confusion. An old man crossing the street holds on to his rosary like he thinks your happiness might spread. People were very suspicious of joy, especially when it came out of nowhere. People in the Middle Ages thought that suffering was a good way to grow spiritually. Being miserable meant being humble. Pain brought me closer to God. Happiness that showed you had made a deal of some kind. People talked about this kind of deal in hushed tones after dark. Not to look the forest in the eye. There were rules about even laughing. The priest started taking notes when a villager laughed too loudly, too freely, or too often. Priests in the Middle Ages were like therapists who didn't have any training and were very likely to say that everything was the devil. The bartender didn't smile back if you walked into the tavern with a smile. He blinked quickly, moved away from you, and thought about whether he had enough holy water behind the counter. Children were even more open to this fear. If a child ran around laughing, the villagers often thought that a fairy had put a spell on the child, or that the child was going to have a dramatic fall that involved a curse, a prophecy, or a mysterious disappearance. Kids weren't supposed to be happy. They were supposed to be scared, small adults who had to do chores. Even the rich and powerful weren't safe. A happy noblewoman might be said to be overheated in the humors, which means she smiled too much and needed to lose some blood to calm down. Some people might say that a happy knight is proud, vain, or too warm in the head. In short, happiness had effects. There was no celebration. It was questioned. People didn't say, "Why are you so happy?" They said, "What evil force gave you permission to feel this way?" Happiness wasn't a gift. It was a red flag from the Middle Ages that was waving wildly in the wind. People in the Middle Ages never listened to music alone. It was loud, crowded, a little messy, and usually out of tune. You heard music at weddings, funerals, festivals, and parties, where half the people were singing one song and the other half were shouting a different one. People didn't like to enjoy things on their own, so medieval music was a group activity. People in the Middle Ages found it very strange that someone would sit alone and listen to music, really listen to it quietly and peacefully. If they saw someone humming to themselves while taking care of animals, or when they saw someone tapping their foot while walking to the market, they didn't think, enjoying a tune. They thought, someone has enchanted him, and it's only a matter of time before he wanders into the woods and never comes back. They believed that music had power, not artistic power, but supernatural power. People thought that songs could bring in spirits, fairies, and even demons who wanted to have a good time. If you liked to listen to music by yourself, you were inviting something magical to join you, like an unwise host leaving their door open. People in the Middle Ages were very afraid of things that could sneak in. This included wolves, neighbors, and supernatural beings whose motives were not clear. Imagine a villager from the Middle Ages sitting alone in a field, humming softly as they weave baskets. This scene is perfectly safe, but anyone who sees it will immediately feel alarmed. A shepherd could drop his staff. A monk who is passing by might cross himself so dramatically that he almost falls over. A woman from the area might rush home to tell the priest that someone is having musical visitation, which in medieval times meant the devil is trying to make him dance. Even playing an instrument alone could be dangerous. Someone playing the flute alone in their hut was almost asking for gossip. The flute was often linked to wild spirits in the woods and seduction, two things that people in the Middle Ages were very afraid of because they had no way to protect themselves against them. If someone had the guts to close there, that was all there was to it. Close your eyes and enjoy the music. Not listening to music with your eyes closed was not relaxing. It was a trance. It meant you were going into a state that only saints, witches, and people who were spiritually unstable tried to get into. A villager who was caught with their eyes closed and a smile on their face was halfway to an exorcism. In short, music was fine as long as it was loud, bad, and had as many people watching as possible. Everything else made me think of magic, evil, or the end of the world. In medieval Europe, harmony didn't exist. Calm the mind. It made people suspicious. Nighttime wasn't just the time of day when it was dark in the Middle Ages. It was a full-on danger zone for the spirit. After dark, villages looked like scary movie sets made by someone who hated people. People made up ghosts, demons, wandering spirits, witches, wolves, and other things to make themselves feel worse about their lives. So, if someone was caught walking outside at night on purpose, not just suspicious, they were almost begging to join the local supernatural community. Think about a villager in the Middle Ages going for a walk outside at night, maybe to clear their head after a long day of farming. They push open the door and take a step into the dark, and right away, every curtain in every nearby hut moves. Like owls, eyes look out. Whispers slide down the street, and a dog growls somewhere because it knows something bad is going on. No one in their right mind would want to go outside at night. That only happened to two types of beings: crazy people and animals with glowing eyes. People in the Middle Ages thought that the line between the living and the dead got thin at night. Spirits moved around freely, demons stalked people, and fairies dragged people into their strange night parades without them knowing. If you were seen walking around by yourself, the villagers thought you were either talking to those forces or being drawn to them. The thought that you might just like being quiet or need a break from. You never thought about your own home. If a monk saw you outside at night, he might really think that a demon had seduced you. Not figuratively seduced, but literally seduced, maybe in a field. People thought that night demons were very charming, and people in the Middle Ages thought that even the most average-looking farmer could be taken by one if he went outside for air. Even your family would freak out. They didn't think you went out if you left after dark, for a walk to think. They thought that you had been possessed, cursed, bewitched, or temporarily kidnapped by forces you didn't know about. And when you got home, your family would ask you questions just like the police do with suspects today. At first, softly, then forcefully, and finally with holy water. People in the Middle Ages would slowly blink and say, "No one thinks at night." That's when the creatures that think roam. Night was for staying inside, praying quietly, and pretending. You weren't scared. It was clear that anyone who went outside was at the mercy of something unnatural. Reading wasn't a hobby in the Middle Ages. It wasn't easy to relax. It wasn't good. And it definitely wasn't encouraged. Most people in medieval villages thought that only three types of people read: priests, scribes, and poor kids who were stuck in monasteries. If you, a normal person, picked up a book and read it for fun, that was pretty much the psychological, like growing horns on their own. Books themselves were already suspicious. They were hard to find, expensive, and written in Latin, which was the official language of people who didn't want you to understand anything. You didn't just own a book. You got it when 4 generations of monks died in the same monastery, leaving behind only one dusty manuscript about how to grow turnips or how to smile too much. So when someone in a medieval village wanted to eat, people paid attention when they read. Attention that is interested and alarmed, the kind of attention that is usually only paid to strange lights in the woods or animals giving birth to something with extra legs. Picture a peasant from the Middle Ages sitting outside with a book. Right away, neighbors start to gather at a safe distance, whispering as if they've just seen a rare demon in its natural habitat. What is he up to? He is looking at symbols. Is he trying to call something? It looks like words. Oh my God, he's a smart guy. The more you read, the worse it got. If people saw you turning pages too quickly, they thought you were learning dangerous things. Information that could make you think of questions. Questions were the most dangerous thing for people in the Middle Ages. Because if one person asked a question, their neighbors might start to wonder why all of their taxes go to a local baron who has never worked a day in his life. Surprisingly, priests didn't like amateur readers either. Yes, they read all the time, but that was different. They read things that were approved, like stories about saints, plagues, and dire warnings. If you, a non-religious person, picked up a manuscript that wasn't religious, the priest would narrow his eyes into slits. You might hear him say something like, "The devil enters through literacy," while holding his rosary too tightly. It was even worse for women to read. A woman who read too much was strange, hard to predict, and probably dangerous. She could learn something. She could have a thought. She might, God forbid, realize how bad men's hygiene really was and get angry. If you read alone, often, or with pleasure, you were seen as mentally unstable, or worse, intellectually curious. People in the Middle Ages didn't see a big difference. In medieval Europe, drinking water was one of the clearest signs that something was wrong with your mind. Not just figuratively wrong, but also literally, medically, spiritually, and cosmically wrong. People thought of water as a last resort, like scraping mold off of food. Old bread, and acting like it was seasoning. So if you willingly grabbed a cup of plain, unboiled, untreated, and suspiciously cloudy medieval water, the village didn't care about you. They were worried about you. Beer was a big part of life in the Middle Ages. There was weak beer, strong beer, expensive beer, and beer that tasted like hay and was hard to tell if it was good or bad. It didn't matter. Beer was a way to stay hydrated. Beer was a way of life. Beer was life. In the Middle Ages, beer was like a multivitamin. You took it because everything else would have killed you. On the other hand, water was like a carnival for microbes. It went through villages, picking up diseases like a hobby, and even when no animals were involved, it always smelled a little bit like livestock. Think about this. You're working in a field on a hot day, and you're sweating out the last bit of happiness you have. The other peasants take out small jugs of ale, which is a safe and trusted drink from the Middle Ages. And then there's you, confidently reaching for a ladle of water from the shared bucket. Every turns its face toward you. A guy drops his hoe. A woman screams so loudly that her chicken runs away. The kid looks at the person like they're trying to cast a spell with the wrong ingredients. To them, no sane person would have chosen water. If you chose water, you either didn't understand how to stay alive or you were trying to die. People in the Middle Ages who saw death every day but were very good at overreacting right away thought you needed help. Your friends might gently pull your hand away from the bucket. Your family might tell you to lie down and rest your nerves. Old ladies would say that your brain must have boiled in the sun. Someone would go get a priest just in case the devil had gotten you to stop drinking water. The priests weren't much calmer either. They thought that demons sometimes told people to hurt themselves in a subtle way, and nothing was more subtle or suicidal than choosing medieval water over medieval beer. If a priest saw this, they might immediately sprinkle you with holy water. Water, which is funny because they would never drink it, and pray loudly to drown out the gossip that was starting to form around you. People in the Middle Ages thought that beer kept you alive, but water showed that you were already lost. Anyone who willingly reached for water was either cursed, crazy, dangerously naive, or clearly having a huge mental breakdown. Drinking water didn't make me feel better. It was scary. People in medieval Europe didn't think it was nice or kind to be nice to animals. People didn't think it was a sign of a kind person or a future veterinarian. There was no job like this, except for the guy who guesses what's wrong with your cow. No, being nice to animals was one of the quickest ways to be called a witch, heretic, or someone who definitely has a deal with something that lives in the woods. In the Middle Ages, animals weren't pets. They were tools, sources of food, or background noise. Cats were made to kill mice. Dogs were made to bark at things. And chickens were there to scream in the morning, like little feathered alarms. So when someone showed an animal unusual affection by petting it, talking to it softly, and giving it scraps from their own small meal, the villagers didn't see this as empathy. They thought it was magic. Think about how normal and harmless it is for someone to feed a stray cat today. But in a medieval village, if a cat took food from your hand, it was like making a deal with a god. People would stop in their tracks. They would talk in a low voice. They would point. People already thought of cats as suspicious because they acted like they knew too much and didn't care enough. It meant that something evil was leading the cat if it trusted you. In medieval Europe, no animal with sense would willingly get close to a human unless magic made them do it. Dogs weren't much better either. People didn't think it was cute if a dog followed you around the village. They thought he could control animals. Heaven help us. A loyal dog was suspicious because loyalty meant having an emotional bond and a connection on an emotional level. Needed free time, which medieval peasants did not have at all. It was strange to think that someone could spend time with an animal instead of working all the time. And God forbid you talk to an animal. Talk to a horse in a soft voice to make it feel better. Witchcraft. While gathering eggs, complain to a chicken. Talking to demons. Tell a goat about your problems when you're feeling weak. You've pretty much told the whole village that you have one foot in a bad place. The idea of even worse was saving an animal. People thought you were practicing forbidden healing arts if you took in an injured bird or nursed a sick dog back to health. Only God, saints, and shady barber surgeons could heal anything. People got very scared if an animal got better because of you, because kindness wasn't kindness in Europe during the Middle Ages. Being nice was a way to get things done. Power was influence, and having power, especially over animals, was scary. Being nice to animals didn't mean you were a good person. It meant that you were one broomstick away from being tried as a witch. In medieval Europe, gathering herbs was not a good thing to do. It wasn't a relaxing hobby, a harmless interest in botany, or the medieval equivalent of, I like gardening because it helps my anxiety. No, picking herbs, any herbs, for any reason, was one of the fastest ways to make your neighbors think you were in touch with the devil. People in medieval times were most afraid of people who knew what plants did. The usual medieval relationship, too. Nature was scary. Plants were strange. Some things healed things, some things killed things, and most things tasted like dirt and did nothing else. So anyone who walked around the woods or meadows with a purpose, kneeling, sniffing, looking at leaves, and mumbling to themselves looked less like a gardener and more like someone getting ready for a midnight ritual. Picture a woman from the Middle Ages kneeling in a field at dawn and carefully cutting rosemary. Completely innocent. She's just trying to add flavor to her stew with 4 ingredients: is 80% barley, 10% hope, and 10% dirt. But from a distance, the scene looks very different to the villagers who see her. They see a single person crouched in the fog, gathering strange plants as if she were making a cursed potion. Half the town has already agreed that she's at least 80% witch by the time she stands up. Even the most basic plants made people suspicious. Chamomile helps you sleep. It's clear that she's trying to make people see things. It's time to cook. It's clear that she's making a spell to make a rival less strong. Peppermint can help with stomach aches, a potion that heals. Not allowed unless done by someone with a vague title like local healer, barber surgeon, or elderly woman who once saw a miracle but might have been hallucinating. The funny thing is that medieval healers used herbs all the time. But people were okay with healers' herbal knowledge because they were officially allowed to look strange. People outside of that small group, on the other hand, were suspicious. A peasant man who gathered herbs was doing something that was against the law. A. The peasant woman was already halfway to a bonfire because she was gathering herbs. Even drying herbs inside made people nervous. Hanging plants from your ceiling in bundles might be perfectly fine unless you lived in the Middle Ages. Then they were signs of bad things to come. People who lived next door would look in your window, see the bundles, and think right away that you were in touch with beings that only came out after midnight. Herbs weren't plants. They were proof. Proof that you knew things you shouldn't have known. In Europe during the Middle Ages, it was dangerous to know how nature worked. It made you feel bad, and if you liked it, that was witchcraft for sure. Being left-handed in medieval Europe was not just a harmless biological quirk. It was a threat to your way of life, a spiritual misalignment, and a clear sign that you had entered the world with a bad attitude. The language even let you down. The Latin word for left was sinister, which people in the Middle Ages took way too literally. Congratulations if your dominant hand was the wrong one. You were guilty of something without even knowing it. They just didn't know what yet. Imagine being a kid in the Middle Ages and automatically grabbing a spoon, or more likely a piece of stale bread, with your left hand. Your mom gasps like she just saw a murder. Your dad looks at you like you have antlers. The village priest, who has been looking for signs of corruption in every newborn since dawn, suddenly appears behind you like a cat and with the worry of a man who thinks. Demons really hate him. The hand itself wasn't the issue. What the hand meant was what mattered. People in the Middle Ages thought that God and the devil were fighting for control of the world. Like two drunks fighting over the last piece of cheese, they are both fighting for your soul. And if you used your left hand more than your right, it meant that the devil was winning. Not because of any proof, of course, but because medieval logic was based entirely on fear and superstition. The worst people were teachers. If you were unlucky enough to go to a medieval school, your teacher's job was easy. Make every kid write with the right hand or die trying. There was no support or understanding for a student who was left-handed. They were punished in a loud, dramatic, and physical way. Teachers would hit your left hand with sticks, tie it behind your back, or tell you how bad evil symmetry is. It didn't matter that your letters looked like they had been drawn by a drunk goose. What was important was fitting in. Even things you do every day seemed strange. If you stirred a pot with your left hand, someone would say that the stew tasted off. If you petted a cat with your left hand, people would say that the animal was now bewitched. If you held a tool, carried a bucket, or said hello to someone with that cursed hand, people would instinctively back away, not knowing whether to be afraid of you or feel sorry for you. People thought being left-handed was a bad thing, a danger, and a cosmic problem. Not because it hurt anyone, not at all, but because people in the Middle Ages didn't know how to deal with anything that was different. And if there was one thing that scared people in medieval Europe more than demons, plagues, and bad weather, it was being different. Being calm wasn't a good thing in the Middle Ages. People didn't like, respect, or support it in any way. The medieval mind thought that calmness was one of the most dangerous states a person could be in. Life was meant to be a crazy whirlwind of fear, pain, hunger, sickness, and the constant knowledge that anything, before dinner, anything could kill you. People didn't think you were smart if you looked calm during all that. They thought you were hurt. Picture a medieval village in the middle of a busy day. Chickens are running through the streets like they're late for something. Someone's laundry is being eaten by a goat. A baby is crying because it has been alive for 3 days and has already given up hope. A blacksmith is yelling at his apprentice because he is too loud. Smoke rises from chimneys with the smell of soup from yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Life is a loud, messy, muddy place. Now picture someone in the middle of it all, calm, quiet, and peaceful, like a monk who just came up with meditation hundreds of years too early. That's self-regulation in today's world. In the Middle Ages, that meant having something. People didn't think that a calm person was someone who could control their emotions. People thought they were spiritually numb. People in the Middle Ages thought that fear was the normal state of being for people, the emotion that is built into the soul. People who didn't show fear were thought to have lost their ability to see danger, or worse, to be working with it. People in the village acted like they had seen dark magic when someone stayed calm while others panicked. A fire starts, everyone yells, runs around, and throws water everywhere, but the calm person just watches and doesn't care. Two conclusions come to mind right away. This person either started the fire or they've made some kind of deal with a higher power to be free of earthly worries. Even in small crises like bad weather, a strange animal showing up, or rumors of a wandering spirit, being calm was scary. People who didn't join the panic were looked at with suspicion. Medieval logic said that if everyone else was scared, you should be too. If you felt anything else, it meant your feelings came from an unnatural place. Priests were especially suspicious of people who were calm. They thought that being calm was a sign of spirituality, something that keeps your fear from getting away. They thought that only saints and people who were possessed could stay calm in the middle of chaos. And saints were very, very rare. In medieval Europe, being calm didn't mean you were wise. It wasn't power, it was a warning, a sign that your soul was either too pure or too damaged for normal life. In either case, no one believed it. People like to think that marriage in the Viking Age was like a romantic candlelit story, but it wasn't. There were no soft focus proposals on cliffs with fjords, no poetic speeches, and no kneeling unless someone dropped a sword and had to pick it up. Marriage was more like a business deal between families, and love was just a nice bonus if it happened to show up before death. What really mattered were the clans that the bride and groom came from, their land, their cattle, and how much political power they could gain together. A Viking marriage started long before the couple met. Usually, two fathers would negotiate like experienced diplomats. They talked about property lines, who has the right to inherit, past fights, and who stole whose sheep 20 winters ago. In Norse society, marrying someone meant tying your whole family's fate to another clan, so every detail was looked at closely. You might think twice about giving your daughter to the other side if they were known for fighting, raiding, or accidentally burning down their long house. The Mund was the most important part of this deal. The groom's family paid the bride price. This wasn't a purchase of the bride, even though it sounds like one. It was really payment for the work and skills that the bride's family would lose. Women in Viking times worked hard on the farm, weaving, and taking care of the house. So losing one meant losing a lot of value. The Munda knew how important she was and showed that the groom's family was stable and honorable enough to marry into. The marriage was set once both families agreed on the terms, and the couple's feelings were thought about in theory. Even though families made the matches, Vikings didn't see marriage as a punishment. The bride had to agree to the marriage. Of course, she didn't have much power to negotiate, like someone trying to argue with a thunderstorm, but her voice still mattered. She had the right to say no to a dangerous or dishonorable match, and sagas talked about women doing just that. Sometimes loudly, sometimes dramatically, and sometimes with an axe close by. When the when the deal was done, the marriage was more than just two people. It was a legally binding partnership. Families became friends, blood feuds could end, trade routes could open, and two clans that didn't like each other yesterday might suddenly act like best friends because they were now in-laws. That was a Viking marriage, not a fairy tale. It was a political contract written in honor, duty, and the occasional passive-aggressive look across the settlement. If Viking marriage was a deal, then the dowry and bride price were the bold runes that marked the whole deal. These weren't polite gifts or gestures that meant something. They were cold, useful things that were meant to keep the bride safe, protect her future, and make sure that neither family acted like fools when the wedding ale ran out. Let's start by talking about the fear and the doughy. This was the property that the bride's family gave her. Clothes, jewelry, livestock, loom weights, keys to the house, and sometimes even land rights. But don't. This was not a gift for the groom, so don't get it wrong. She was rich, and she had full legal rights to it. Imagine getting married today with a treasure chest that only you could open. Your husband would have to be very careful not to touch it, or he might get humiliated in public and have to fight. That was the Viking dowry. Then there was the munda, which was the money the groom's family paid to the bride's family. It sounds like buying a wife on sale to people today. But in Viking culture, it was different. The Mund showed that the groom's family was serious, honorable, and financially stable enough to join the alliance. If a man couldn't pay for it, the marriage didn't happen. Viking women may not have chosen their husbands directly, but fate usually kept them from marrying broke idiots. Now things start to get interesting. In the end, all of this property protected the woman, not the man. The dowry went with her into marriage, and the bride price became part of her security and her children's inheritance, if her husband did. If he did something dishonorable, like cheating, not providing for her, or starting a fight with her family, like a total amateur, she had power over him in court, in business, and in a way that made even the bravest warrior think twice about his life choices. And Viking men were aware of this. When a woman got married, she carried her keys, which were real iron keys, to show that she was in charge of the family's money. She was in charge of the food, the valuables, the money from weaving, and the house, if her husband passed away, or disappeared during a poorly planned raid, which happened more often than families want to admit. Her dowry and bride price made sure she wasn't left with nothing. So, even though Viking society was clearly patriarchal, the economics of marriage showed a quiet truth. Women in Viking times were not weak. Their money went with them. They were safe in their rights. And if their husbands ever did something wrong, things got even more fun. But we'll talk about that later. Before a Viking marriage contract was signed, there was something like courtship, but it might be too nice to call it that. People in the Viking Age did not date the same way we do now. There were no long walks on the beach, no awkward dinners, and no texting back after 3 days. Instead, there was a strange mix of family negotiation, subtle signals, public reputation, and the occasional heroic act that involved killing something big and nasty. Most Viking couples had their families set up the match. But that doesn't mean that attraction or personal preference didn't exist. It just worked quietly, like a squirrel that was scared. A young man might show interest by helping a woman's father with work, or by bragging about how strong and skilled he is at gatherings. A young woman might drop hints through her actions, like offering a man a drink first, sitting next to him at meals, or showing that she could run a household well, because nothing says romance like showing off how good you are at churning butter. Still, arranged didn't mean forced. A lady could say no to a match, and they did a lot in saga literature, sometimes calmly and other times very loudly. She could turn down a suitor if he had a reputation for being violent, incompetent, dishonest, or just smelled like he hadn't bathed since the last blood moon. A smart family listened, because not listening to a strong-willed Viking woman could lead to a fight with an axe. Men had to show that they could do the job too. Money, honor, and connections were all important. People didn't think much of a man who didn't have land or cattle, marriage material unless he was really good at something. The kind of guy who could come back from a raid with enough silver to blind the sun. Viking masculinity was more than just having big muscles. It was about being responsible and being able to keep a home safe. It's an interesting that courtship could also include giving gifts. Jewelry, carved bone pieces, or well-made tools were ways to show love. But here's the catch. Giving a woman a gift without her family's permission could mean you have a secret relationship, and that could set off fights. So, to date a Viking, you needed to be charming and careful at the same time. One wrong move could make it seem like your romantic intentions are a political threat. But the most surprisingly tender part of Viking life before marriage was talking. Men and women did talk to each other in private, subtle, and smart ways. They shared ideas, tried to see if they were compatible, and got to know each other better. It wasn't poetry, but it was real. Emotional intelligence was important in a world where honor and survival were important. Since, after the clans shook hands and drank beer, these two people were stuck together for life, or at least until someone asked for a divorce. A Viking wedding was not a quiet, classy event with flower arches and neatly folded napkins. It was a big community event with drinking, speeches, ritual objects, and enough symbolism to make a modern therapist smile. Weddings could last for days, depending on how rich the families were, and they were so important that even people who didn't like each other had to go. People who didn't like each other were supposed to show up and act like they were happy about it. The ceremony itself was very ritualistic. The first step was to separate the bride and groom from their old selves. The groom went through a symbolic cleansing, which often included bathing. It's important to note this because Viking men were known to bathe more often than men from medieval Europe. The bride went through her own change, which sometimes meant taking off her maiden's cranson, a delicate ring that unmarried women wear. Her hair could be rebraided to show that she was grown up and ready to take on new duties. It's like getting ready for a Viking battle, but with more meaning and fewer hairstylists. Because they did, weapons were very important. The groom usually carried a sword, which was sometimes a family heirloom that had been passed down for generations. He gave this weapon to his bride as a sign that he trusted her to protect the home. In return, she gave him gifts that stood for keys and other things that give you power in your home. Today, giving someone a sword might make people raise their eyebrows or call security. But in Viking culture, it was the most romantic thing you could do. Then came the exchange of oaths, which were done in front of witnesses because Vikings took promises as seriously as they took fights. The couple promised to be loyal and work together, and their families celebrated the deal with a feast. These promises weren't poetic, but they were real. In a culture where reputation was important, people talked about breaking a marriage vow for decades, and it was the kind of disaster that people talked about for years. The feast that came next was where things really got going. Ae and I flowed like rivers. People sang songs, told stories, and the scolds, Viking poets, read verses praising the new alliance. A wedding could become famous if the food was good and the guests were well behaved. And finally, after the public ceremonies, there was the private sealing of the marriage, which was the bedding ceremony. The families took the couple too. They went to their room, lit candles, and left gifts that meant something to them. They should have left before things got weird. Not only was the alliance agreed upon, it was also confirmed. The wedding was over, and now they were married. That's when gender roles, social norms, and household power became a lot more interesting. After the wedding feasts were over and the mead barrels were empty, the Vikings started their married life. And it was a lot more organized than people think. Hollywood loves to show Vikings as crazy, violent people who don't care about anything, kept track of their marriages, let alone their boots. But in reality, Viking homes were like small kingdoms. The wife was usually in charge of the kingdom. The law said that the husband was the head of the family. He was the public face of the family in politics, trade deals, raids, and any other situation where people had to shout across long distances. But once he walked into the longhouse, the real center of power often moved. The wife had the keys, real iron keys that stood for having control over all of the household's resources. She was in charge of the locked chests that held valuable items, food, textiles, tools, and trade goods. A husband wouldn't just take something if he wanted it. He asked. It was the Viking wife's job to run the farm, organize the work, give out food, run weaving workshops, direct servants or thralls, and keep the peace in the house. She was the longhouse economist, the logistics officer, and sometimes the unofficial judge of who. What argument started, she took over the whole estate. If her husband died, went on a trip, or got lost on a raid, which happened more often than you might think. Viking law said she was a fully competent property manager, which many later medieval societies wouldn't even think about. On the other hand, the husband's job wasn't just to swing a sword at boats that passed by. He took care of things outside the farm, like defending it, making deals with neighbors, keeping alliances, and providing for the family through farming and trading, or attacking. The roles worked well together in a healthy marriage. The wife took care of the inside world, and the husband took care of the outside world. Both jobs were very important. The house fell apart faster than a badly built longhouse in a windstorm without one. Contrary to what people think, Viking couples often worked together and treated each other with respect. Sagas talk about husbands talking to their wives about decisions, asking for advice, and even changing their plans based on what their wives say. A smart man paid attention to his wife. A stupid man would ignore her, and he would usually pay for it with his reputation, money, or surprisingly creative family problems. Life every day wasn't glamorous. It was work and more work. But it was work that everyone did, and that made their partnership stronger than most people today think. Vikings didn't think marriage was perfect, but they did value loyalty, competence, and helping each other. And when that loyalty was broken, Viking women had some very dramatic choices, and that's what's next. When it came, Viking society had expectations about fidelity, and they weren't as one-sided as most people think. Yes, husbands were supposed to be faithful, and no, cheating wasn't just brushed off with a boys will be boys attitude. A married man who was caught sneaking around could face shame, legal trouble, and, depending on how his wife felt, the chance of being woken up with cold water, a missing beard braid, or the sharp edge of being responsible. People took affairs seriously because they could hurt the stability of clans. A child born outside of marriage could cause problems with inheritances, fights, or social chaos. Viking laws made it clear that cheating on your spouse hurt your reputation, and reputation was everything. If a man was accused of cheating, he could be challenged, fined, or shamed in public. And if he kept breaking the rules, the punishments got worse, and sometimes they were violent. But here's the twist that most people don't see coming. Women in Viking times had even more strict rules. Yes, a woman who got caught cheating got harsher punishments, but she also had a built in way out of jail: the right to divorce a man who wasn't living up to his end of the bargain in the marriage. If her husband was not taking care of her, not providing for her, or bringing romantic distractions into the house, she could legally, publicly, and even proudly leave him. There are many examples in the sagas. The story of Gudrun Oyfa's daughter is so famous that historians still quote her lines like they are legendary mic drops. She confronted her husband about cheating on her. She later got a divorce from him that was legal. Backing. Then there's the well known story of a woman who not only divorced her cheating husband, but also challenged him to a real duel because he insulted her honor after the divorce. If your ex tried to insult you, you would say, "Meet me outside with weapons." Women in Viking times didn't play. Women were also safe from being falsely accused. It was a serious insult to call a woman unfaithful without proof, one that was bad enough to start blood feuds. If a man spread these kinds of rumors, he could lose land, money, or even his teeth, based on how her family was feeling that day. People were careful even when it came to romantic rumors. People could start fights by sitting too close at a feast, giving gifts, or whispering too privately. So flirting with Vikings wasn't just dangerous, it was almost like a sport. There was one idea at the heart of all this. Honor was more important than desire. Marriage was a partnership. Fidelity kept that alliance safe. And if anyone put it in danger, Viking law had answers, and Viking women weren't shy about using them, about how to use them. The Vikings would like to talk to you if you think divorce is a new thing, preferably yelled across a big house with 20 people watching. Norse society had clear rules for ending a marriage, and women had more power in this process than in many later European cultures. A Viking woman could start a divorce, do it in public, and leave with her property and dignity intact, and sometimes even more intact than her husband's pride. The most common way for a woman. To ask for a divorce was surprisingly useful. She just said it, not in private. Oh no, the Vikings didn't keep things quiet. A woman had to say her decision in front of witnesses at important places in the house, like the front and back doors, to make it official. This was like posting a breakup message on every social media site in one day for the Norse, and she didn't need big reasons. Viking law allowed divorce for many reasons, including abuse or violence, which was taken very seriously, not being able to. If a husband couldn't provide food or clothing, he wasn't keeping his end of the deal. Cheating, which was seen as breaking the marriage vow and insulting her family, was a surprisingly common reason in the sagas. Not being interested in the marriage bed, which is politely described in legal texts with admirable vagueness. Women could also divorce widowed men who were too different from them, too old, or too fond of starting fights for no reason. The law did not compel a woman to remain in a politically disadvantageous marriage. Her, the honor of the clan, was more important. After the divorce, the woman got back her dowry, her own money, and any property that was agreed upon in the marriage contract. She kept any land she brought into the marriage. She also got credit for running the household well and raising the value of the farm. The husband didn't lose everything, but he did feel the social sting. A divorced man had to work hard to fix his reputation and find another family that would be willing to marry into his track. Record. Some sagas even say that women would divorce men right away in the middle of an argument, during a feast, or after finding out something they didn't like a secret lover, a broken promise, or a husband acting like a child instead of a responsible adult. And yes, there are famous stories of women challenging their ex-husbands to a duel over slander. Viking version of divorce court. It was easy to see what made all this happen. Viking marriage was a deal, and contracts could be over. Women weren't. Property, they were business partners, and Viking law didn't just let her leave if her husband wasn't good enough, it almost held the door open. Divorce gave Viking women unexpected power, but being a widow took that power and gave them the whole long house with a bow on top. In Norse society, a widow wasn't expected to just disappear or depend on the kindness of her family. Instead, she took on a lot of power and often became the sole ruler of her home. Some Viking men probably rolled over in their graves when they saw their wives run the farm better than they ever could. But that was just how things worked. The widow took over the estate when her husband died, whether it was peacefully in bed or dramatically during a raid that went wrong because of too much confidence and not enough planning. Not just a part of it, not just a symbolic corner of it, but all of it, until the kids grew up. She took care of the land, the animals, the servants, the debts, the income, and the trade. She made choices about the farm's future, gave her kids permission to get married, and settled arguments. People who tried to take advantage of her grief often found out that Viking widows got over their grief quickly and were very good at negotiating. There are a lot of widows in the sagas who became powerful in politics. Some had a lot of money under their control. Some fleets were managed. Some arranged marriages that changed the fate of whole clans. And others, like real Vikings, got married again quickly, not because they were desperate, but because remarriage was useful for strategic reasons. A widow could bring her late husband's estate into a new marriage, which would make her family's position stronger. And here's the twist. Widows were free to pick their next husband. Families still gave advice and made deals, but all of a sudden, a widow's opinion was much more important than it had been the first time. She was older, richer, and much better at the political game of staying alive. A man who wanted to marry a widow had to. He had to impress her, show her respect, and not make a fool of himself. The power dynamic was very different. Men often fought hard for a widow's hand, especially if her land was fertile or her cattle were plentiful. But being a widow wasn't just about power and getting married again. It also came with respect from others. People understood how hard it was to lose a spouse, especially in a world where life was short and dangerous. A widow who kept her husband's honor, took care of her children, and kept her land safe. People looked up to her and sometimes feared her because of her strength. In many ways, being a widow gave Viking women something rare: freedom. They were no longer wives or daughters. They were the heads of their families. They could choose peace, marriage, independence, or ambition, and the law would back them up. And with all this power came another question: how did people raise their kids in a world of alliances, honor, and planned marriages? That's where we're going next. In Viking society, kids weren't just raised to get through long winters and avoid the odd stray acts and grow beautiful braids. Those skills were definitely helpful, but the main reason they were raised was to keep the family line going and make alliances stronger through future marriages. From the time a child took their first breath in a smoky long house, their life was full of clan plans, inheritance plans, and the never-ending chess match of family politics. The stories and rhythms of farm life were all around boys and girls as they grew up, of old heroes and the clear ideas of who they should become. Viking parents were honest about life. They didn't put off talking about hard subjects until you were older. They explained to their kids how honor worked, how alliances were formed, and why insulting the wrong person could lead to very bad things involving swords. Kids learned early on that their reputation was worth something. Girls learned how to run a household, make clothes, heal people, and the delicate art of social diplomacy. Important tools for future wives who might one day own a whole estate. A girl who could plan a feast, settle a fight, and keep the winter stores stocked without starving. People thought the sheep would make a great wife. Mothers definitely passed on what they knew. Daughters learned by watching, listening, and doing things. Boys, on the other hand, were ready for their own roles, learning how to farm, trade, fight, and negotiate in public. But even though modern stereotypes say, imagine that Viking dads didn't raise little raiders who only swung axes and yelled. Boys learned how to be responsible landowners, trustworthy partners, and reliable friends. A young man who got into fights or acted stupidly put the whole family's reputation at risk. This isn't a good way to get future in-laws. Viking law was surprisingly fair when it came to inheritance. Sons got land and money, but daughters also got property and things that could be moved. A daughter's inheritance was often part of her dowry, which gave her real power when she got married. If both parents died, the family council, which was usually made up of uncles, aunts, or grandparents, took over, but the estate stayed with the kids. Getting kids ready for marriage wasn't about love. It was about leaving a mark. Parents looked for matches that would improve trade routes, end fights, or gain more power. But kids weren't just pieces in the game. Their choices were important. Not always enough to get around politics, but enough to guide talks. And so Viking society kept going. Children grew up, families made plans, alliances were formed, and marriages tied clan networks into huge webs of duty and chance. Love sometimes grew, and other times it didn't. But the legacy stayed. The Medici court was a work of art, with every fresco, velvet curtain, and polished marble floor carefully arranged to create an illusion. Florence loved beauty, and the Medici knew what it was. Better than anyone else, they turned it into a weapon. The court wasn't a peaceful place for philosophers and painters to drink wine and talk about Plato behind those bright Renaissance surfaces. No, it was a pressure cooker of ambition, seduction, and political maneuvering that looked like polite conversation. Anyone who walked into Palazzo Medici, or later Palazzo Veo, could feel it right away. The tapestries had a lot of tension in them. Couriers bowed deeply, smiled warmly, and lied without any trouble. A compliment could be real, or it could be the first step in a trap. A friendly invitation to dinner could lead to a new partnership or a new scandal. Every move meant something. Every what mattered. Even the servants quickly figured out that silence was worth something. The Medici themselves were at the heart of this sparkling world. Powerful bankers became de facto rulers, and a family that was rich enough to buy loyalty and dangerous enough to demand it. Cosmo the Elder, Lorenzo the Great, and Catherine de' Medici. Each generation made the court look like them. Lorenzo filled it with poets, philosophers, and musicians. Catherine put spies, ladies in waiting, and a lot of paranoia in it. Different styles, but the same basic plan. Take charge of the story and the court. The Medici family home was beautiful, but it was more of a political stage than a home. Every room had two uses. During the day, reception halls were used for diplomatic meetings, and at night, they were used for secret meetings. In private rooms, there were sweet romances, angry fights, and secret affairs that could change the balance of power. The gardens were even lush, fragrant, and peaceful, and they were places where people could meet to make secret promises and have secret meetings. People expected elegance. There had to be restraint. But behind the silks, brocades, and carefully crafted smiles were real human wants. Ambition, jealousy, fear, and desire. And in the Medici court, those wants had effects. A careless flirtation could start a fight. An affair that is kept secret could ruin a marriage, a fortune, or a family's reputation. But these same scandals could also make the smart, the ones who handled both politics and passion with equal skill. The Medici court was a jewel of Renaissance Italy. It was bright, beautiful, and sophisticated, but like all jewels, it had sharp edges, and many people who tried to get to it ended up bleeding. From the outside, being a courtier in the Medici world looked like a lot of fun. Everything looked fancy, with silk robes, glittering banquets, poetry readings, private masks, and walks through scented gardens. But there was a harsh truth hidden beneath the beauty. The court of the Medici was a battlefield, and every courtier was both a soldier and a target. To stay alive in society, you needed more than charm. It needed planning, self-control, and a smile that could cut through marble. A courtier had to learn how to act in a way that was planned out in order to do well in this world. Sometimes it was safer to be quiet than to talk. Sometimes it was safer to talk than to be quiet. One wrong word said at a party could ruin a reputation faster than spilled wine on silk. Courtiers learned to read faces as well as scholars did. Read manuscripts. A noble woman shifts her body a little, and a duke stops laughing. These little things decided who was friends with whom, and court status wasn't set in stone. It changed like the weather in Florence, which is always changing. One minute you were eating next to a Medi cousin. The next thing you knew, you weren't invited to any more gatherings because you supported the wrong marriage, offended the wrong poet, or, God forbid, wore the wrong color on the wrong day. Believe it or not, fashion was political. If the Duchess liked emerald green this season, wearing ruby red wasn't a brave choice for her. It was a call to arms. Many courtiers came to Florence hoping for a promotion, a marriage, a job, a patron, or a big pension. But the Medici didn't give out rewards for ambition easily. There were always strings attached to every chance, and those strings were usually knotted. If you said something nice to a Medici prince, it might get you a favor, or it might make a rival who had been flattering him 5 minutes before you jealous. Got here. Even smart people and artists who were part of the court's cultural circles weren't safe. If you made a joke about the wrong classical figure, you could get in trouble for the rest of your life. And then there were the secret agents. Yes, there were a lot of them in Florence. Ladies in waiting, scribes, stable boys, musicians, and people who made perfume. A lot of people were paid to watch, report, and change things without making a fuss. Catherine de' Medici perfected this system after moving to France, but she learned it in Florence, where secrets were the second most valuable thing after gold. Still, the courtiers stayed, even though it was dangerous. At the Medici court, scandal wasn't just a threat, it was a chance, a well-timed rumor, a carefully planned coincidence, or a whispered confession in just the right ear. And all of a sudden, things changed overnight. Behind velvet curtains and frescoed walls, survival was a show, and the best performers rose to the top. Flirting in the Medici court wasn't innocent. It wasn't even secret. It was a show on a stage where everyone acted like they couldn't see anything and wrote down what they saw for later. Desire was both intoxicating and deadly in a world where alliances and reputation were everything. Courtiers walked on a razor's edge, where one look could mean love, insult, or strategy. People in the Renaissance loved the idea of courtly love, poetry, longing, and beautiful metaphors about hearts that burn and souls that ache. But in Florence, this romantic idea coexisted with real politics. A nobleman might read a sonnet to a married woman, not because he loved her, but because he thought that getting her to like him could help him get to know her husband's political circle. A woman might smile at a visiting diplomat for a little too long, not because she felt sparks, but because flirting helped keep foreign alliances strong. In the Medici world, love was rarely pointless. Each compliment had a reason. Every move had a meaning. But even planned games could spark real passion. There were confessions. In the dark corners of gardens, in dark hallway alcoves, and in private lodges with views of the rooftops of Florence. Lovers gave each other gifts like a ribbon, a glove, or a piece of hair. Each one was a silent promise that had to be kept from the wrong people, and there were a lot of wrong eyes. The ladies in waiting told everything. Tutors and scribes listened from behind doors that were only partly open. The fresco even seemed to stare, judging every meeting in silence. The danger made the passion stronger. A married woman who was caught in it could be sent to a convent, exiled, or humiliated. A man who was caught up in a scandal could lose his job, his money, or his political support. But scandals still grew like roses in the Medici gardens, beautiful, fragrant, and full of thorns. Some affairs became famous. Lorenzo de' Medici himself loved poetry, beauty, and flirting that was not too obvious. His court drew in men and women whose beauty was known all over Italy. The affairs that linked rival groups were even more dangerous. A romance between families on opposite sides of the aisle. Political groups could make Florence less stable faster than a bank loan that goes bad. In the worst cases, passion led to murders, as the Medici learned all too well during the Psi conspiracy. But for every sad love story, there were also quiet, sweet connections that never made the news, relationships that made it through the drama, couples who were able to hide their feelings well enough to stay together. Still, in a world where frescoes glowed and chandeliers sparkled the most, brilliant light and passion always made the darkest shadows. Love was not a big part of marriage in the Medici court. It was about dynasties, alliances held together by silk, and the fine line between ambition and looks. A wedding for a noble person in Florence looked like a fairy tale. Gowns made of velvet, jewels that sparkled, and banquet tables that were full of roasted pheasants and sculpted marzipan. But underneath all that beauty was a deal that was as carefully worked out as a trade treaty. Families looked at possible spouses the same way bankers do, assessed investments. A good marriage could raise the status of a whole family, give them political power, or save them from going broke. The Medici were bankers first and rulers second, so they knew this better than anyone else. They set up marriages with the same care as accountants balancing books. A bride brought with her land, art, and status. A groom offered connections, military support, or a way into powerful social networks. It was thought to be a nice extra if love grew later. If. It didn't, but that's what separate bedrooms were for. Inside these arranged marriages, everyone was expected to get along, or at least act like they did. Couples learned how to act in public, with polite smiles, synchronized gestures, and the appearance of affection. As if they were very close, a wife might walk next to her husband and whisper funny lines. A husband might offer his arm during ceremonies, as if he really trusts his wife. But the truth was often more cold. A lot of spouses lived separate lives that only crossed paths when politics called for it. Noble women had to meet very high standards. A meaty bride had to be the perfect mix of elegance, modesty, diplomacy, and the ability to have children. She was the pride of her family, and Florence kept an eye on her all the time. One mistake could start rumors, and in Florence, rumors spread faster than the Arno during flood season. But even with these limits, women had quiet power. A smart wife could. With just one whispered suggestion, she could change her husband's alliances, change the opinion of the court, and make sure her kids had a good future. People also looked closely at men. A husband's reputation depended on how well he could keep things stable. If he made his wife feel bad in public, ignored her, or let scandal into their home, the court was just as hard on him. After all, a man who couldn't run his own house probably couldn't handle a political crisis. In the Medici world, marriage was a working together, sometimes cold, sometimes warm, sometimes brilliant, but always planned, and when the illusion broke, the effects were felt all over Florence, like shock waves. In this court, a broken marriage didn't just hurt people, it broke up alliances. That was a lot more dangerous. In the Medici court, cheating wasn't just a mistake, it was an event in politics. A rumor about a mistress, a secret lover, or a forbidden relationship could spread quickly through Florence, like an earthquake. Affairs weren't just fun romantic things to do, they were strategic threats, weapons, chances, or disasters that were about to happen. In this world of silk and secrets, everyone acted shocked by the scandal while secretly enjoying every sinful detail. Let's begin with the guys. In Renaissance Italy, it was expected that noblemen would have mistresses as long as they did so in a respectful and private way. A well-placed mistress could ease political tensions, win over allies, or even help a man's reputation as long as she knew her place and followed the unspoken rules of court etiquette. But if she got too brave, tried to get power that wasn't hers, or insulted a noble wife, things got out of hand. Affairs could cause duels, fights, and broken alliances. A bad mistress could destroy a whole family. Women, on the other hand, had to follow stricter rules. If a noble woman had an affair, she could be exiled, have her marriage annulled, or be put in a convent. But the risk didn't stop a lot of them. Why? Love and loneliness were strong reasons for doing things, especially when their arranged marriages felt like polite prisons. Women made emotional connections, wrote letters to each other, and risked everything for moments of passion or understanding they couldn't find at home, all behind heavy curtains and locked bedrooms. Some of these affairs became famous. Think about Giuliana de' Medi's relationship with Simonetta Vespucci, the most beautiful woman in Florence and Bukele's muse there.